As a species, we're pretty good when it comes to inventing new things, from the creation of drinkable alcohol thousands of years ago to the incredible devices used to create, record, and consume this video. The catalogue of ideas that have become reality over the years is truly impressive. However, that's not to say that everything created by humans has had a positive impact. Over the centuries, we have come up with some pretty morbid contraptions, and in today's video, we're going to take a look at some of them. During the 18th and 19th centuries, those who had dedicated their lives to discovering exactly how the human body worked had a little bit of a problem. As any technical tinkerer will tell you, the best way to find out how something works is to take it apart and get a good look at the insides. Obviously, although this is no less true when it comes to living things, it is far more socially acceptable to carry out your investigations on a subject who is deceased. Unfortunately, during the aforementioned period, interest in human anatomy had skyrocketed, and although laws in the United Kingdom and United States meant that anybody who had been executed could then be used for scientific investigation, there simply were not enough criminals to go around. This shortage of cadavers quickly led to the creation of a somewhat distasteful line of work known as body snatching. Basically, teams of body snatchers, also known as resurrection men, would enter cemeteries under the cover of darkness and illegally exhume the recently deceased. Once they had taken possession of a reasonably fresh corpse, it was then the simple matter of selling it to a medical school or other research institution, especially as many of them operated a don't ask, don't tell policy when it came to just exactly where that body came from. So, where does the mortsafe fit into all of this? Understandably, people weren't all that keen on the thought of their recently deceased loved ones being disturbed from their eternal rest, and because of this, a number of deterrents were put in place. Initially, the use of something called a mortstone, essentially just a giant stone placed on top of a new grave, was attempted. While these certainly did make things a little more complicated, the body snatchers quickly realized that they could just dig down beside the stone and then remove the corpse through the side of the coffin. First used in Scotland around 1816, the mortsafe put a stop to all of that. Heavy cast iron constructions, usually built by the local blacksmith, these ingenious devices were either bolted or padlocked around the coffin, making it exceptionally difficult for anyone to quickly remove the body. Given that, after the deceased individual had buried, any would-be body snatcher only had a short amount of time before decomposition made the corpse useless for research purposes, these contraptions were usually rented out for a month or so by the local parishes, a sort of early-style subscription service that could be purchased by families, and once their loved one was no longer a viable target, the mortsafe would be removed and reused. Obviously, for families who had the money, the option of having one of these devices made privately was available, and many examples of these morbid but necessary devices can be seen in graveyards and cemeteries to this day. Electricity is pretty incredible. Before most of us leave the house in the morning, we would have used a plethora of electronic devices. Think about it. The alarm on your electrically powered phone wakes you, and before you get out of bed, you use your electronically powered Wi-Fi to check your emails, text messages, social media, etc. Then, depending on your house, you wash your electronically heated water before brushing your teeth with your electric toothbrush and head downstairs to enjoy coffee from your electronically powered machine, and maybe even some electrically brown toast. It is, in short, everywhere. Sadly, though, as we're all aware, just because something has become ubiquitous, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of its uses are positive. Somebody who could definitely attest to this, albeit only briefly, was William Kemmler, who on the 6th of August 1890 became the first person to be executed by electric chair. For quite some time before this execution, public opinion had been turning against the use of hanging. Although this method of execution had been used for centuries, it was not uncommon for the entire process to take as long as 30 minutes, and more people were of the opinion that this was inhumane. So a quicker, less drawn-out method needed to be found. In 1881, Dr. Albert Southwick proposed a solution. While in New York during 1881, the doctor witnessed an elderly drunk man touch both terminals on an electrical generator and experience an instant and painless death. Far from being distressed by this experience, Southwick appears to have been inspired, and it was not long before he recommended electrocution as a new and improved method for executing the condemned. In 1889, New York's electrical electrocution law was passed, and the job of designing the necessary apparatus was given to Edwin R. Davis, an electrician working at Auburn Prison. The design that Davis came up with was surprisingly similar to the device still used today by 4 different states in America. 2 electrodes were connected to the condemned criminal, one to the head and one to the lower back, and once that person had been suitably restrained, an electrical current would be applied. Unfortunately, for the man who would be its test subject, its first use was not as efficient as predicted. According to one report, after he was strapped in, a charge of approximately 700 volts was delivered for only 17 seconds before the current failed. Although witnesses reported smelling burnt clothing and charred flesh, Kemmler was far from dead, and a second shock was prepared. The second charge was 1030 volts, and it was applied for about 2 minutes, whereupon smoke was observed coming from the head of Kemmler, who was clearly deceased. An autopsy showed that the electrode attached to his back had burned through to the spine. As there are today, there were mixed opinions on whether or not this new method was indeed more humane. Dr. Southwick, the man behind the initial idea, said, "We live in a higher civilization from this day on." George Westinghouse, one of the innovators when it came to new uses for electricity, took a different view. Apparently, after being told the specifics, he simply said they would have done better with an axe. Regardless of people's feelings on the matter, the debate on whether or not human beings should be allowed to end their lives on their own terms is one that has gone on for centuries. So let us put to one side the ethical issues and instead focus on one man's idea as to just exactly how those who chose to do it might end their lives. Gyula Jonas Urbonas, a Lithuanian artist, designer, engineer, researcher, and founder of his country's space program, once proposed a bizarre, adrenaline-filled roller coaster. This roller coaster differed from every other ride of its kind in that once you'd ridden it, you'd never ride it again. In fact, you'd never do anything again. Obviously, this crazy ride was never built, but as far as we have been able to ascertain from looking at the plans and carrying out some calculations, it would have indeed served its purpose. So how did it work? Well, the ride car, which would be capable of carrying 24 passengers, would begin a slow ascent until it reached a height of about 510 feet or 155.4 meters. Once it reached its maximum height, the car would stop, and this would be the final chance for anybody to change their minds. Once everybody on board had pressed a button to indicate that they wished to continue, the car would plummet downward, reaching a top speed of 223 miles per hour or 358.9 kilometers an hour before entering a series of loops that decreased in size until the G-forces involved would literally starve the brain of oxygen and cause asphyxiation. When asked about the ride by a reporter, its designer said, "The speed and design of the roller coaster would cause riders to lose consciousness and then eventually pass away from the lack of oxygen going to their brains. The biomonitoring suit that passengers wear double-checks if there is a need for a second round, which is extremely unlikely as the result is guaranteed by 7-fold repetition." While it seems almost inconceivable that any such mass suicide machine would actually ever be constructed, we feel that, on balance, it is probably a much nicer way to go than the electric chair, especially if you happen to be a big fan of roller coasters. When asked to picture a chainsaw, the majority of people will probably conjure an image of a large petrol-powered device being used to fell trees or turn those trees into logs. However, what if we told you that the original use for this device didn't actually involve cutting any wood at all? In fact, the original chainsaw was developed by 2 Scottish doctors in the late 1800s and was designed for cutting bone and cartilage. More specifically, it was designed for cutting the pubic bone and surrounding cartilage to, shall we say, widen the exit during troublesome childbirth. Even now, with today's advances in modern medicine and pain relief, giving birth can not only be exceptionally uncomfortable, but can result in all sorts of medical complications. During the period of history that gave rise to the chainsaw, cesarean sections were carried out as an absolute last resort, as they often resulted in the death of the mother, the child, or both. According to one medical journal, quote, "Far more common during this period in history was the surgical procedure of symphysiotomy. During this procedure, the pubic symphylis, which is a joint above the vulva covered and connected by cartilage and reinforced by ligaments and tendons, is severed to widen the pelvis and make the childbirth process a bit more likely to occur." As with any surgical intervention of this era, speed was of the essence, not least because options for pain relief were extremely limited. While the procedure could be carried out with more conventional surgical tools, the advent of the chainsaw, which at this point was driven by a hand crank but would shortly be mechanized, made the process a lot faster. Unfortunately for all of those involved, mainly due to poor or in some cases non-existent hygiene and sanitation practices, any such surgical intervention had a high likelihood of resulting in serious infection, and due to the fact that effective ways of treating these infections had not yet been invented, they would often result in death. Although almost every gymnasium in the Western world is now equipped with several of these machines, they were originally designed with a much darker purpose in mind. If you ever found yourself using one of these machines, looking down at the depressingly small number of calories burnt and thinking, this is torture, then you are on the money. This is, in fact, what the original purpose of the treadmill was. Designed by British civil engineer William Cubitt in 1818, the original treadmill differed from its modern-day incarnation in a few ways. Firstly, it did not have a handy electric motor to drive it. The power was provided entirely by the user. Secondly, it was designed to be used by more than one person at a time. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, it was not installed in an air-conditioned gymnasium, but rather in prisons across England. The first of these machines, installed in Brixton Prison in London, was attached to underground machinery used to grind corn. 24 prisoners at a time would power the machine for up to 10 hours a day. This particular method of torture became so popular that by 1842, the treadmill was being used in 109 of the 200 jails across the UK. Although theoretically these machines were supposed to increase prison productivity by creating products such as flour that could then be sold, in reality, they were more often used for physical and psychological torture, with the grinding equipment often being completely devoid of corn. Not only was this cruel and unusual punishment, but it was often deadly. According to an 1885 article from the British Medical Journal called Death on the Treadmill, in England alone, these devices were responsible for at least one prisoner death every single week. The article ended by saying, "The mill is not useful and has proved itself occasionally injurious." This, we believe, can be described as something of an understatement.